Mr. Speaker, society is becoming more and more violent towards minorities by the day. Now the question rises, shall we sit back and watch passively how this all unfolds itself, or shall we act? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The motion before us today is this House believes it should be a criminal offence to make comments which could promote hatred against people of particular races, religions, disabilities, sexualities, or gender identities. Now, before getting into a constructive case, I will bring up some definitions for this case. First of all, criminal offence, that is punishable by law. Then, could promote hatred, that could incentivize negative animosity in a direct way towards these minorities. Now, which one is the problem and the reason why we're debating this today? This is because in the world there is a mass increase in the amount of negative and incendiary comments towards these groups, fueling violence and on the rise and creating more, fueling these ultra-right groups in many countries around the world. Now, what is the proposition we'll prove to you today? First of all, that it further protects human rights for vulnerable groups, and then that it aids in the reduction of hatred. Now, we're going to divide our speech our debate into three main points. First, we are the world, where we're going to talk to you about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then we're going to talk to you about how is it that we must adapt laws. Then rehab, how is it that we must have proper punishments, and then how is it that if we actually bring those punishments, we are sending a different message to society. And then rising exponential, how is it that what we are proposing actually hinders the creation of new hate. But before getting into that, which one is our framework? We're going to use the same method as today used against hate speech in many countries around the world, where a complaint must be filed, and then a judge and a jury will decide over the matter and enforce the sentence if it is what it is needed. Now, getting into our first argument, which is divided into two parts. First, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then the adapting laws. Now, when we talk about we are the world, we're referring first of all to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 22 mainly, which talks about the fulfillment of individuals. Now, when we discriminate towards individuals, we're acting directly against this human right, because we're not allowing them to fulfill properly, because we're acting against their race, against them because of their race, their religion, and so on. Now, we can see that these comments against minorities actually attacking themselves, actually harming their moral and physical security, but even so, ladies and gentlemen, this leads to violence. Now, how does it lead to violence? First of all, violence from the majority, and then it could actually bring violence from the minority, the groups being directly attacked through these comments. Now, we have two examples for that. First of all, the Nazis. We can see that throughout their whole party history, they created hatred against Jewish people, igniting public support for this idea, creating more and more violence, ended up in what actually happened, which was the Holocaust. But even so, ladies and gentlemen, we can see that it actually ignites violence from the person being discriminated. The German shooter that actually acted against people in Germany 2 days ago. He was not being accepted in society because of what his parents said, and even so because of what he said during the shooting, which was of course terrible. He said, "I am German." We can see that he was not being accepted in society. He was being discriminated because of his race and his religion. Now, ladies and gentlemen, passing to the second point of this argument, the adapting rights. We must understand that in theory all rights are absolute, but when it comes to practice, we must actually adapt them to fulfill their objective and actually satisfy all of our rights. Now, we can see today that there are limitations towards these rights. For example, laws against hate speech around the world. But hate speech is not enough, because this only talks about mass audiences. And we can actually limit mass audiences, but we can see that this is also failing. How? We can see, for example, the cases in Germany and in France, where houses of refugees were lit on because of this, though there are laws against hate speech in these countries. Now we can see how it is that the small comment is the one that moves around society, actually intrinsically, slowly but surely changes and creates and leads to violence. Now we can see through all of this how minorities are being accused of generating problems when they also have to live with their problems with not being accepted in society. So again we see how this generates a harm to the whole group again and again and again. So through this point we prove to you that first of all we're protecting human rights, then we are actually bringing the proper analysis of how today's limitations are not enough and we need more, and then how we prove to you that we need a deterrent, something to actually stop and improve the situation. I accept your point.
Will you prosecute people for hurting other people's feelings?
No, sir, but the thing is differently, because we are actually attacking their religion. We're actually going against their human rights. It doesn't come to feeling, it comes to the basic idea that they have human rights. They are equal, they're equal to me, they're equal to you, and so they have the right to actually live with their religion, live with their race, and not being discriminated because of it. Now moving into the second point of our case, rehab, which is divided into two. First, pillars of punishment, and then the social message. We must understand that the punishment has three pillars in itself. First, get the people out of the system, then create a precedent, and after that, rehabilitate. Now, how is it that when we get people out of the system, we get an improvement? We get all these people who are actually discriminating against those minorities that are being harmed, and we actually avoid discrimination, generating discrimination towards them as we exclude them from the system. Then we create also a precedent, because we are telling people how serious this crime is and how they shouldn't commit it, and we're actually avoiding the creation of new criminals by showing them that if you commit this, you are a criminal, and people will obviously try to avoid this. But even so, ladies and gentlemen, the point of the punishment at the end is rehab. Today there is no rehabilitation towards these problems, towards violence, towards discrimination and comments against minorities. And on our side, we are creating rehabilitation. And what is it that we're creating? We're creating more education. And through education, we create understanding. Through education, we create acceptance. And through education, we create less hate comments towards these people, less discrimination, and a more fair society for us all. Now, on the social message, how is it that today, by not acting against it, we're actually implicitly accepting? People are entitled to do whatever the law says. Anything that is not against the law, meaning that if it's not actually against the law, I can do it and I have the right to do it. But on our side, we're making it illegal and not accepting it, not legitimizing it how it is happening, as it is happening today. Because in the status quo, we're normalizing discrimination. Society is used to it and it needs to change. Think about a case of a kid who is constantly in contact with his parents, in constant contact with their teachers, in constant contact with their friends. At the end of the day, if we accept this, we are actually creating the idea that this is alright, that people can actually make comments against others because of their race or because of their religion, and that is how society should be. We cannot normalize this idea. So because of all this reason, ladies and gentlemen, because we proved to you that we should actually comply with human rights, that we should actually limit how this is happening in order to make it applicable, and how we need a deterrent, and how is this actually at the end of the day in line with the social message at the point of the punishments. We stand by the phrase that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. The speaking time was 8 minutes and 12 seconds. I'd like to welcome the next speaker, Sean, from the opposition.
John Wesley once said, "Set yourself on fire and the world will come to watch you burn." It is unfortunate in April 2013, a Russian teenager who was gay and was my age had to resort to just that to have his message spread across the world. When he alighted and set himself on fire in front of the Kremlin because every single news station in the local media refused to report his story to spread awareness of gay people. We say that these laws, like blasphemy laws and slander laws, have been used by governments and the majority to continue to oppress the minority, and for that reason, we reject the state of affairs, we reject Team Proposition. Before we move any further, Team Will today supports a few things. Firstly, we will abolish all kinds of laws that criminalize speech which could promote hatred against people of particular races, religions, disabilities, sexualities, or gender identities. Now, before we move on to our substantive arguments, we have 2 points of contention. Firstly, I'd like to take a look at their motto. Secondly, I'd like to ask, will their motto actually protect minorities? So firstly, let's take a look at their motto. Their motto is very interesting, right? Because in the definitions they come up and say, we think that promote hatred means causing animosity. This is very unclear to me. What is exactly causing animosity? This is a very nebulous notion as to what causes animosity. Because, panel, when I commit a crime, a lot of contributing factors cause me to commit the crime. No, thank yous. This means that ultimately, you need to draw a clear distinction which your second speaker can clarify as to what exactly and how much will you actually prosecute these individuals when they have hate speech for in this particular instance. No, thank you. They didn't just the notion of you want to use a court. They said you want to use judges and jury. 2 responses. Firstly, courts are controlled by majority in a lot of cases. This means that in countries like South Africa, for instance, where the entire judging panel are installed by the South African President Jacob Zuma, who are ANC sympathetic judges, which means that all the kinds of things you're trying to protect minorities from will only be exacerbated because these judges will always rule against the minorities in all instances. And then let's talk about juries. They talk about juries, right? Panel, by virtue of being a majority in a particular state, this means that when you draw a section of individuals of society to form the jury, it's very likely that these juries are usually made up of majority citizens from the entire society, which means they'll always rule in a certain way that oppresses minority, so it's not clear as to how your model will solve this. I need a clarification from our next speaker. So secondly, let's talk about whether their model protects minorities. What do we hear? We heard that we want to protect human rights of minorities. This is very nice sounding, but the problem is, when the majority sets the law, you change nothing. Panel, give you the example of Raif Badawi in Saudi Arabia, who spoke out against the majority interpretation of Islam and as a result is jailed for the rest of his life. The problem, when you give majority the powers to decide what a hate speech is, they can define what isn't a hate speech and therefore use it to continue to oppress the minorities within these regions. This means that if particular things that they want to talk about, no thank you, want to be talked about, the majority can use this to actually remove the entire conversation altogether and say, this is not a crime, we don't really recognize it, and therefore, too bad for you. Next of all, we say, ultimately it's worse on your side of the house because the ability for individuals of minority backgrounds to be protected is dependent on social acceptance. We say on your side of the house, there's no social acceptance because you just drive the bigotry underground. So now, instead of going out and say, I hate Chinese people, you just take it underground where people just talk around on their dinner tables within their homes away from the eyes of the public, and we say that is bad. No, thank you. Now, finally, they want to talk about education and social message.
But before you continue,
hold on, which is very interesting. Panel, this course only happens when reasonable people clash with the bigots in society. This doesn't happen anymore when you drive all the discourse underground into the homes away from the public sphere. We say on that ground alone, you lose education, you lose discourse. Tell me why you haven't.
We would say that on your side of the house, these people hate in public and they expand their message, but on our side of the house, they are alone and they are segregated from society. And
the reason why the Civil Rights March succeeded and the reason why African Americans today can vote and have the first African American president of the United States is because the bigots publicly clash with the moderates. We say that it's only when the kinds of clashing happens in public you cause and provoke social discourse, the kinds of thoughts that say maybe African Americans are people too. What happens on your side of the house is you drive this message underground, the change will never happen on your side of the house. Your second speaker needs to come up with a response. Now let's go on to my top substantives. We will bring you a 3-part case. Firstly, I'll be talking to you why hate speech doesn't constitute a criminal offence. Secondly, why such laws on their side will be used by the majority to oppress the minority. And my second speaker will lastly be talking to you about why discrimination and radicalism against minority worsens on their side of the house. So firstly, let's talk about why hate speech doesn't constitute a criminal offence. To be clear, the criminal justice system does not wield its extraordinary powers except under very clear circumstances. That is to say, for something to be a criminal offence, there's a very high bar it needs to meet. We are now going to demonstrate why their model doesn't meet this high bar. Panel, we say that ultimately there are a few criteria that the criminal justice system must meet to make something criminal, right? For instance, it must prove definitive harm. It's the reason why if I punch somebody, it's assault. Because assault definitely harms you. It hurts your body autonomy. It hurts you as an individual.
Sure.
It's the reason why, no thank you, if I commit arson for instance, I set someone on fire, I kill the person. No thank you. Because it causes definitive harm. We think that this is qualitatively different from hate speech. Because ultimately, on two levels. One, if I say something that's racist, for instance, it doesn't necessarily hurt individuals. In that situation, everybody has a different reaction to that particular comment. Which means, ultimately, definitive harm on the metric is not met to begin with. No, thank you. But on the second level, we say that this doesn't necessarily promote harm altogether, right? No, thank you. Because I can say hate speech, but it doesn't necessarily cause hatred against other people. It doesn't necessarily cause harm against other people. On that ground alone, we think you've completely killed the high bar and the metric used for criminal offence. For that reason, we think it's unjustified. Before we move on to the last substantive, yes.
You talk about this not causing definitive harm, but we're talking about the consequences that do cause harm. What do you call the German who shot people because of the oppression he was suffering?
Okay, let's consider an alternative. If someone calls me a chink right now, does that mean I'll definitely burn people's houses on fire? No. So you have to prove to us how somebody calling me a particular racial bigoted term will cause me to cause harm or social disorder within society. We think insofar that you cannot prove that link, this means that you have failed the fundamental tenet of this definitive harm that's used to justify criminal offences. We think on that ground alone, the point is gone. Okay, let's move on to my last substantive, or why making such comments will be used by the majority to oppress the minority. Panel, recognizing the status quo, governments have made such comments a criminal offence to prevent minorities from racial and sexual backgrounds from achieving social change. Why? Because with the passage of time, certain lifestyle choices have been accepted by the majority into mainstream society as the norm. We say, for instance, in countries like Singapore, the heterosexual lifestyle is the only lifestyle that people can adopt and conform to. What happens when you allow for minority lifestyles to actually be respected is that you allow them to place a value judgment on the majority lifestyle. For instance, when you say maybe gay people can be recognized, you instantly place a value judgment on every single other person who's currently not a gay to begin with. We say this threatens the power structure of society and the position of dominance that these majority have. Is the reason why they currently try to use these kind of blasphemy laws and libel laws to prevent this kind of speech from happening to begin with. Recognize, panel, that the majority who by virtue of their large numbers have control over governments and religious authorities. We give the example of the government in Russia, who the vast majority are from the Orthodox Church within Russia, and therefore made the kinds of hate speech against the Orthodox Church illegal. It's the reason why when the Pussy Riot Band actually made such speech against the Orthodox Church, they were actually imprisoned. So ultimately we say that their policy will cause the majority to use these laws to continue to oppress minorities, but more importantly, prevent the kinds of essential discussion that we need to actually create social change. Why do we think speech is important? We think speech is important because it provides a platform for every single individual, because of their size and numbers, to provoke social change by what they say. This is fundamentally illegal right now on their side of the house, and for all these reasons, we're immensely proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, Sean. Speaking time was 8 minutes and 12 seconds. I'd like to call Alejo now to give a speech.
What is subjective about saying that Mexicans are rapists? What is subjective about saying that a person is this or that because of the color of their skin or where they come from? On side opposition, they seem to have a problem distinguishing this. But on side proposition, we see there is nothing subjective about this, and these things are not to be put into consideration and are not to be put under the stigma of subjectiveness. So, Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The two things we have proven to you today on side proposition is that this further protects human rights of minorities and vulnerable groups, and the second thing is that this helps in the reduction of hate. And we have done so far with our first two arguments about We Are the World with regards to the violation of human rights and how this promotes violence, and the second one about rehabilitation, where there is a message of acceptance and that this is we need to set a precedent. Both of these which were not attacked by team opposition. So before I expand over our third argument about rising exponential, about not inciting violence and helping to reduce this, I will begin with some refutation of what was said by team opposition until now. So beginning with the first thing, about what they said in a POI, about the hurting of the feelings, and they asked them, are you going to file a lawsuit against people who are hurting other people's feelings? So the first thing we would say is that, okay, yes, these comments do hurt people's feelings, but the second thing we would tell you is that this motion goes far beyond this, that this motion speaks about marginalization, about segregation, about discrimination. So it's not about hurting people's feelings, so they can try to ridiculize what we're saying all they want, but the reality is that what we're speaking about here is that comments that incite violence, comments that lead to things that like what happened in Munich 2 days ago. The second thing they spoke about was governments using this oppressing people with these laws. First of all, they brought no analysis and a vague example about Russia, which they didn't really explain. And the second thing we would tell you is that we don't really understand how it is that these juries would actually go against these minorities. They never said so. They just took, for example, that, okay, because they're a part of society, they're going to go. But we would actually need more analysis inside proposition, and we demand this from the second speaker. So, no, thank you. So what they also said was that what causes animosity, and how much would you prosecute? So this is a good question, because first of all, it shows that they're trying to ridiculize what we're saying and saying that, okay, maybe or maybe not, this could be subjective. But the second thing we would tell you is that we see nothing subjective about these comments. And the third thing we would tell you, in these extreme cases, subjectivity is lost, because in these comments that these people say, which lead to direct hate, in these comments which directly marginalize, which directly discriminate, there is no subjectiveness. Okay, no, thank you. So they also spoke about that we're driving the bigotry underground, and that we're not analyzing the real problem, and that the people will just go and hate somewhere else. So first of all, they brought no proof of this actually happening. So just because it says it doesn't, they say it doesn't make it true. But the second thing we would tell you is that we're not doing this. And the third thing we would tell you is that even if we took them on their highest ground, on our side of the house, these people can go outside and expand their message, and these people can go outside and convince other people of what they're saying. And on our side of the house, these people, okay, may or may not hate inside their house, but they will know that the matter when they get, no, thank you, that the moment they get out of their house and expand this message, they will be trialed in the highest of consequences. So on our side of the house, we see a quick reduction of all of the harms that they said. On their side of the house, what they're saying is the maintenance of the status quo, which is causing so much harm to people already. So they said that to be a criminal, it has to cause harm, and to be in a criminal offense, it has to cause harm. So first of all, thank you for the definition of what this means. But the second thing we would tell you is that firstly, insulting, segregating, discriminating, and making comments that cause violence is actually harming the person. Because you actually, no, thank you, because you're actually insulting them. So we appreciate the second speaker saying that he doesn't feel insulted. But what we would say is the majority of people actually do, and this does cause a harm. And the second thing we would tell you is that the consequences of these comments actually cause harm. Because when you grab a person who then goes and kills people outside because he was being marginalized, because these are the groups that are inciting the violence, the ones who are being marginalized by the people who do the hate speech, those consequences cause tangible harms not only to the people being oppressed, but to the rest of society that does none of these things. So they also spoke about, no, thank you, about these speeches are needed for social change. So first of all, we would like a clarification on what that really means, because it's a very nice phrase, but the second thing we'll tell you is, why would we need hate speech to cause a social change? What is it that they believe that hate speech is so positive to society that it would actually cause some sort of change? The only thing no, thank you. The only thing this causes is an increment of violence, the expansion of hatred messages. The only thing that we can say here is that history has proven that this has in no way been constructive towards society, and in the only cases where these messages have actually been expanded, it has led into catastrophe, and we've already given the example of the Nazi regime, which they have not clashed with. No, thank you. So another thing that we would like to clarify before we go to the constructive is about they didn't clash with any of our two arguments. They started speaking about a lot of things like enforceability and the subjectiveness, but they in no way did they refute our argument about firstly the human rights and the secondly about rehabilitation. So we would challenge them to do so in the second and third speech. So now moving towards a bit of constructive. Moving on to the third
On that
argument.
point, sir.
Before I do this, I will take that point.
The Ahmadi community in Pakistan is constitutionally discriminated and outlawed by our government. Show me how a judge will rule in the Ahmadi's favor if
First of all, this example is brought by you. So you're going to have to show us concrete evidence saying that these juries will have a reason, and you are going to have to prove that in all of these cases, these juries are actually going to file against them, because we could give you a counter argument. We would say that these juries will not go against these people, but you're the one who brings these examples, so you're the ones who need to give evidence as to why this will actually happen, not just hypothesizing. So moving on to the third argument. So we understand that these commentators expand the message, the hatred, and they attack minorities and they foment the violence that already exists. But we're not aiming at changing these people, because we know that the people who hate are very difficult to change. No, thank you. But what we are doing is preventing the creation of this new hate. Because, for example, many times the hate towards these minorities doesn't even exist or partially before the expansion of this message. But rather these people use situations, like for example in the case of Donald Trump, they use the fear against a certain group, or they use situations like a terrorist attack to create and turn that into the hate that people have. So we would say that by not letting these people expand their messages, for example, we're preventing the creation of new hate, because this is the case of how it happens. And also another example we can give you is that when the people prohibited Nazism, for example, and its principles and practices, they didn't create more hate. They made these people reduce the things that they were saying. They made these people be marginalized, and what we did was the effect that we're here proposing to. We saw a reduction in this hate speech, a reduction of the people affiliated to this party, and now they are a clear minority and have no influence in society. So another example about the American Council of Islamic Relationships, showing that in 2010 there was an increase until now of 37% in the hates towards Muslims. So we would say that these messages are actually are actually a lot of drops that are growing into a very big ocean. So by reducing this, we would be reducing the problem by its cause. So the people who hate won't stop hating, but now they will hate alone, which is what we want to do, and they will not be able to expand their message. And the people who don't hate will not be influenced. So we have proven to you today that it doesn't bring more hate without a third argument, that it doesn't that this is a clear violation of human rights, and this incites more violence. So, Mr. Speaker, if there's one message that is to prevail from this debate, is that we must act now to end these messages, and that this is our moment, and this is our time to act. And this is why we very proudly stand by the phrase that if you are not part of the solution, you are most definitely a part of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. The speaking time was 7 minutes and 48 seconds. Now I'd like to invite Ellen to give her speech now.
Solution, you're part of the problem. That's what we were brought by Team Proposition today. We'd like to point out to the proposition that this quote is only applicable when A, the solution actually works, and B, that there aren't any better ones. And we've given you a better one. We've told you about discourse and about how historically discourse has been used as the main way to eradicate discrimination against minority groups within society. And that is why we won this debate today. I'm going to talk a bit about why discrimination and radicalism worsens in the long run and therefore why this policy is ineffective. But first, I'd like to discuss what were brought by the proposition today. 3 questions in rebuttal. Firstly, how do we reduce discrimination? Secondly, does hate speech cause a definitive harm? And thirdly, will this policy be abused? So, how do we reduce discrimination? So they spoke to us a lot about human rights abuses and claimed that we never responded to this problem. Right, note, this is only applicable if they actually reduce discrimination in the first place. And I'm talking about in this question and also in my argument about why that isn't the case. So we told you very clearly, right, that discrimination is only reduced when there is discourse within society, when bigots clash against moderates, when people talk, when they express their views, when people are exposed to viewpoints that they've never even heard before. That is how we get people coming together and talking rationally about this. That is how we reduce discrimination, and that is what we were talking about. That wasn't a sort of assertion, as they tried to say. We've shown you why this discourse won't happen under this motion, because it will be driven underground. Racists will only talk to racists. Homophobes will only talk to homophobes. And they don't get exposed to other viewpoints, they don't get exposed to things they might agree with in the future. We heard this was an assertion, and that even if they did, at least they're not doing it outside of the house. We'd like to point out to the proposition that even if they're not verbalising their discrimination against other people, there are many other ways to express that discrimination, and your feelings about these minority groups are going to get worse, as I'll point out later. No, thank you. Note that they also conceded that these people will be driven underground and won't stop being as racist or as homophobic or as discriminatory in their third argument, when they said that these people will never change. Second question. Whether or not this causes a definitive harm and whether or not it is justified by prosecution. We think when somebody says something to you, you have the right to decide how that feels, right? You have the right to decide what impact that has on you. If I punch somebody, there is a definitive harm because I have bruised that person or I have broken that person's arm, no thank you. That's caused a definitive harm. But if somebody says something offensive to me, it is up to me whether or not that has caused me any sort of harm. It is not up to the justice system, no thank you, whether or not that has caused me any harm. So our point still stands. Thirdly, will this policy be abused? So we gave you an entire argument about how governments will use this. And we gave you a number of examples as well. We were told that this was an assertion. We were told we gave no analysis behind this and therefore it didn't stand. Firstly, we did. But let me go over it again because it seems that this team did not, no thank you, catch it. They told us a lot in their opening of the first speech about how many people within society are biased, about how there's hate crimes, about how people hate on minorities. If these are the people that make up the majority of society, and within that the society, they vote for the government, the government, no thank you, then chooses the judges. If they make up the vast majority of the jury, we think in those cases this can be abused. We gave the example, no thank you, of the band Pussy Riot, who were in fact protesting against the government because they disagreed with Vladimir Putin, and then were jailed for 2 years for offences to the Orthodox Church. We think that is an example of where this can be abused. They also gave us an example of Nazis. We think that works for our side of the house, because in Nazi Germany, the government was actively condoning this discrimination against these Jews. In that case, firstly, why would they implement this policy in the first place in Nazi Germany? Secondly, why would the government have an incentive to make sure this policy is actually enforced? So that falls on our side of the house.
Madam.
Sure.
What we refer to here is the fact that when they reduced this and they made it illegal to speak about these things, to practice this, it is when the violence reduced, and you cannot argue with those results.
Firstly, you've given us no example of anywhere where it is absolutely 100% certain that banning discriminatory words has led to less discrimination, right? We think that in the examples of where discrimination against minority groups within society has reduced, it has reduced because of discourse within society, as I'll go on to elaborate in my argument now. So why discrimination and radicalism is worsened in the long run? There are 3 groups of people that we're talking about within this debate. We're talking about the extremists, we're talking about the moderates, and we're talking about the liberals. So the extremists, these are people who under the status quo hate these minorities, they hate black people, they hate gay people, they hate Muslims. So what happens when they're told they can't express that hate against these people? They feel persecuted by the government. They feel as if the government is prioritising these minorities over themselves. It gives them a narrative narrative, these minorities are restricting what they feel are their fundamental rights. It makes them feel as if they're justified in hating these minorities. And what do when they can't make these comments? They express this hate in other ways. They know that now, that no matter how they express their views, be they through comments, be they through violence, be they through killing people, they're going to get prosecuted. And if they're going to get prosecuted anyway, why not go all out? Why not bomb a black church in America? Why wouldn't the KKK do that under this motion? No thank you. So they start getting violent. So we think under this motion, actually violence towards minorities is increased by extremists because now they have nothing left to lose. Now they are justified in hating these minorities. Secondly, moderates. So these are people who feel ambivalent about these minorities. You know, before they felt, okay, we're quite happy to have them in society, but I don't really feel anything either way. So now the government is restricting their rights. Now the government is restricting their freedom of speech on the behalf of these minorities. They start to feel resentful. They start buying in to extremist narratives. And this is bad, right? Because if people become more likely to dislike these minorities and casually discriminate against them by walking across the road when one of them is walking towards them, by not employing them in their businesses. And I'll take a point of information if one is available. Never mind.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes, you said that that we haven't brought a solution and that your solution magically was the discourse. So let's take up the example of the status quo, for example. There is discourse and the amount of violence between moderates and the radicals has actually increased because there's more terrorism and there's more problems between these two groups.
So we think the discourse will work in the long run, right? We think that people will talk to each other within the society and discuss their viewpoints, right? We think that is something really, really important to recognise is happening under the status quo, and in the long run, we feel this will be effective. We're not saying that this policy is going to change the world overnight. We're saying it will change it 50 years down the line, 100 years down the line, and we're saying that your policy will actually make things worse. Thirdly, we're talking about liberals and moderates who will now feel afraid to express their viewpoints just in case they offend someone, just in case someone misunderstands them and they get prosecuted. They don't want to risk prosecution, so they don't educate themselves on minority struggles. They don't get involved in discussions on minority struggles. But this is bad because people feel uncomfortable expressing their viewpoints and there's less discourse in society. And also less people in society understand the problems that minorities face, right? Which then means that there are less people within society working on minority rights and pushing on these problems that minorities face. So because we think this policy is not only bad and makes discrimination and radicalism worse, but it also infringes on a number of rights in order to do so, we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much all for your speech. This speech was 8 minutes and 16 seconds long. Now, please welcome the third speaker of Proposition, Lucas.
Once again, if you're not actively against it, you're implicitly accepting it. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For one of the last times today, the motion before us is this House believes that it should be a criminal offense to make comments which could promote hatred against people of particular races, religions, disabilities, sexualities, or gender identities. Now, what did side proposition have to show you in order to win this debate? We have to show, first of all, that this further protects human rights or vulnerable groups, which side opposition is barely related to by saying that, well, it's a worthy sacrifice if it brings a long-term solution, which we believe is not an acceptable answer for reasons I'm going to mention later on. Our second burden was that this aids in the reduction of hate, another fact that side opposition couldn't prove. So the debate was basically divided in two main parts: subjectivity plus applicability, and secondly, social change. So let's begin with subjectivity and applicability. Now, the opposition has quite a twisted perspective. And how do we know this? Because in a POI, they asked us, well, will you punish someone for hurting feelings? And this is where we see their perspective and where their logic is flawing. Because this goes way beyond simply hurting feelings, as they like to put it. This is about the active marginalization of groups. No, thank you. Now, we asked the opposition simply to not reduce the motion to something as insignificant as what they're trying to do. Now, what they tell us is basically, well, comments are subjective. It depends on the people whether they feel offended or not. And we have a few answers to this. Well, first of all, they told us that we must prove that this would cause definitive harm. So we have a few answers. The first one is that subjectivity definitely fades when it comes to extreme comments. When it comes to comments such as my first and second speaker said, that relate to specific race, telling them, what are you doing in my country? What are you doing here? Get out. This is not subjective. This is active discrimination, and these are the comments that cannot be faded by the opposition. Therefore, their case falls on this. The second answer is that the harms don't necessarily have to be harmed feelings, as they like to put it. The harms are the marginalization of groups, and if this isn't a harm, then we don't know what is. No, thank you. Now, the expansion of hateful messages is also the expansion of harms, and this is what we're trying to bring up on side proposition. Those that are harmed are also the ones that go on and take extreme actions because they feel marginalized. And we asked the opposition, what kind of is this not a harm? And they could not answer. So then going to the point of applicability. We heard from side opposition this idea that, well, it depends on the country. The countries like Pakistan will never rule in favor of minorities, and the judges could be swayed. So we also have quite a few important answers to this that side opposition never told us about. Now, when we're talking about countries where there isn't an abuse of power, and why is this? First of all, we believe that this abuse of power isn't in the majority of cases. But secondly, even if we took them on their highest ground and accepted that it was the majority of cases, we would tell you that a government that already discriminates doesn't need a law to continue doing so. Therefore, if Pakistan already discriminates against its people, as the opposition told us, well then it will continue to do so whether or not we apply this law and whether or not people are punished for discriminating against minorities. Therefore, their whole argument based on judges and juries being biased, they already are if this country is against the people. They already are if this country has a negative bias towards its people. Let's go on to the second point of clash, which is social change. Who achieves true social change within this motion? The proposition or the opposition? Let's analyze this in depth. The opposition brings up that they're even in favor of hate speeches, that they don't mind because this is healthy dialogue. And we have quite a few answers to this because they also told us, well, they can provoke social change through hate speeches because of what they say. And this is not social change. I'll take you in a second. This is hate. Yes, please.
What makes people change their opinions about minorities? Being told they're not allowed to express them, or being told by somebody else what they're
Okay, I understand your point. Now, their first wrong assumption is that a majority is against everyone. And this is not true. What we're talking about is a minority of people actively discriminating against another minority. And their active discrimination can spread the hate. What we're trying to do is stop this hate from spreading in the first place so that we don't have a majority against the minority. And this is where the opposition fails to see it. So, once again, the social change doesn't come through hate speeches, which has hate in its name itself. So we have no, thank you. We have nothing against dialogue. But let's get a few things clear after this. Those who make the comments aren't usually the ones who actively cause physical harm. Yes, they do cause the verbal harm, but not the physical harm. Therefore, the example of the KKK suddenly not being able to express itself and going to bomb a church doesn't apply. What we're telling you is that those oppressed and marginalized are the ones that act violently. Those oppressed, because of this lack of a law against their oppression, are the ones that will go and take negative actions against society, such as the example that was not refuted by the opposition of what happened just here in Munich a few days ago. We begged them for an answer that should have come earlier. So let's go on. Within this, this oppression of marginalization, this is where we gave the example of nationalism versus refugees. This idea that those who are with the nationalistic feeling that they must spread the hate against refugees must have their message stopped before it reaches the rest of the people. This is not the healthy dialogue because not most people believe this, and we do not want most people to start believing this. That's why we must cut the message before it reaches everyone. No, thank you. So once again, we're cutting off the message. Continuing here, we're absolutely okay with healthy dialogue. And this is what the opposition doesn't want to understand. We're not in favor of hate speeches. No, thank you. And this is not, hate speeches aren't simply talking to each other. We brought up inside of the proposition what a hate speech truly is. This is the active discrimination with truly hateful comments, discriminating and causing harms within society, spreading the hate within society. They told us banning it will make things worse, other than that there are other ways of expressing the hate if we ban it. We asked them, well, which ones? And they said they'd talk about it later on. They never told us which other ways of expressing the feelings there were, therefore we assume there aren't. Continuing within this, we brought the example of the Nazi affiliation being banned within Germany. The opposition couldn't efficiently answer to this because the Nazi affiliation ban actually stopped the message and stopped the hate from spreading. Therefore, when hate speeches were reduced and the violence was reduced, the connection the opposition couldn't answer when we brought it up in a POI. So, once again, we brought this idea of hate against Muslims increasing from 10% to 37%, almost 4 times in the last 5 years. So, what they tell us is, well, what we want to ask them is how is allowing this going to stop the spread? And what they told us is, well, it's not. No, thank you. It's not going to stop the spread. It's simply going to be a long-term solution within the next 50 years. And what we want to tell you on side proposition is that that's unacceptable. It's unacceptable at every level because we need a solution now. Not in 50 years when already the harms will be caused and these ideas will be ingrained in society. Otherwise, that we must take them into account now and cut off the message while we can. So, once again, we can't wait for this under the actual conditions and under the conditions that are being developed. So, negative social change is under their side, and we've proven our point. Now, through our 3 main arguments, the first one saying we are the world, we showed how these comments were a clear violation of human rights. Nothing from side opposition on this. Now, all rights are absolute, but you can limit them when it comes to this. Secondly, the rehabilitation, nothing from side opposition again, which is absurd. We gave the pillars of punishment and how rehabilitation currently isn't in place. How do we expect to change people if there isn't a punishment? Now, once again, the third argument, which is the rising exponential, we want to prevent the creation of new hatred. So for all these reasons, on side proposition, we could prove the burden. There is social change for the positive on our side, it's negative social change on their side. And that's why, at the end of the day, if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucas. The speech was 8 minutes and 10 seconds long. Now, please welcome the third speaker from Team Wales, Amani.
Three issues in today's debate. Firstly, I'll be talking to you about their model and how it's intrinsically flawed. Secondly, I'll be talking to you about minorities and which side is actually safeguarding them better both in the short term and the long term. And thirdly, I'll be talking to you about autocracies and how you're enabling them to discriminate against minorities. Moving on, starting with my first issue. The first question we asked them is, show us how these juries will not rule against these people, right? And they never really properly gave us a response. In fact, they asked us to substantiate upon this. And here's when I'll do that. So I'll show you how basically what happens is in countries like Pakistan, which by the way, do form majority of this debate, right? Because you had a proposition here that wanted to argue solely on the basis of examples from the US and the UK. We say that Pakistan is not the only country which actively discriminates against minorities, state-sanctioned discrimination against minorities. We give you the example of Iran, of Russia, of South Africa, of Pakistan, of Saudi Arabia, of India. Ladies and gentlemen, that is where this debate takes place. The debate does not take place in the 3 or 4 liberal democracies that they were able to come up here and give us. But we'll show you how even in those liberal democracies, the kind of benefits that this speech will lead to in the long run are still worth the cost that they're highlighting. But let's show you what these juries are going to rule against these people, right? Because in countries like Pakistan and India, where basically what essentially happens is where your government elects these judges and where these juries are formed the majority of the people in your country, right? These judges are more likely, no thank you sir, to rule in favor of the rule in favor of the majority. And here's why. Because in Pakistan, you don't really have media censorship, right? You have media censorship. You don't really have Ahmadis or other minorities being able to voice their opinions. You don't have active political discourse, which is exactly what we're talking about. As a result of it is the majority opinion and the government's opinion that permeates society. As a result of which, there is no discourse. So as a result of which, what happens is basically, if a court rules in favor of an Ahmadi, not only will there be public outcry and riots, but your government will get really, really angry because Ahmadis are constitutionally outlawed and are discriminated against by your government. Which is why you will have biased juries and biased judges. Never really showed us how that would work. The second thing they said, this is going to incentivize negative animosity in a direct way. Firstly, what does that even mean, right? Because different people react to different things in different ways, and there's no way to quantify a reaction before the action is actually taken place, right? So if I come, no thank you sir, and hurl an abuse at someone, they could react in 2 extremely different ways. So we don't understand how exactly they're trying to make a link between incentivizing negative animosity in a direct way. But now let's moving on to my issues and minorities, right? The first thing they said was this violates their human rights. This violates their human rights. We talked about emotional harm and physical harm. So firstly, we don't think no human right actually exists which says you have a right to get yourself protected from emotional harm. So clearly in this debate they're talking about physical harms, right? Let's talk about actual violence over here. So we never said we had an issue with prosecuting people for violence, right? So if you have an uprising like you had in Nazi Germany, we're obviously in the status quo not going to let that happen. So that entire example doesn't really stand. The only example that they then had was the example of the incident that happened in Munich, right? And with which we say, ladies and gentlemen, they have to come up here and show to us how there's a definitive link between what that person did in Munich and what the majority at that point was espousing. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, that that link doesn't exist because there's a variety of reasons why an individual could react in a particular way, ladies. And that's why in countries like Pakistan, in countries all over the world where you have terrorism, the government doesn't force women to wear burqas and go on the street because them showing their legs could cause a reaction to the Taliban, which will then bomb the entire city. No, your government holds the Taliban accountable because they understand that they don't make subjective laws, no thank you sir, to protect people which actually don't really substantiate on harms, right? And now let's deal with their point on how you're excluding these extremists from the system, which they accuse us of not actually tackling their entire argument about rehab, right? But the truth is they actually dropped it in the second speaker and we only heard of it in the last 3 seconds of their third speaker speech. But let's actually talk about this. Firstly, they never substantiated why this is important. It was an assertion, how are you going to rehabilitate these people? Secondly, you're not really excluding these extremists from the system, right? You ignored my second speaker's argument because if you ban these people from speaking, they're going to be so much harder to detect because the team of proposition is living on an ignorance is bliss kind of basis, right? And we feel just because you can't see these people doesn't mean they don't exist. In fact, the fact that you can't see them anymore makes them even more dangerous, right? So and that's something that I'll be talking to you about within my third issue, right? And here's what we say, we're going to fix that. We're going to fix this because now the majority opinion isn't going to be the only opinion within your society, and these minorities are also going to be able to voice their own dissenting opinions, as a result of which there will be discourse. And they said no thank you, they came up here, thirdly, they came up here and talked to you about refugees and how you're actively harming these minorities because the majority will be able to say stuff about them and oppress them. Firstly, we say minorities are already being harmed within the status quo, right? Because the majority view already permeates the system. So if you stop this minority from speaking out, it is them who are essentially not being able to speak out because majority view
Ma'am.
still continues to exist. No, thank you, sir. And we say we're changing that. How are we changing that? Because we're empowering these minorities to speak against these majorities. We're doing this in liberal democracies where, for instance, you might have a white racist narrative within a particular community and black people are scared of speaking out because of outlash. And on the other hand, we're doing this in authoritarian democracies where government laws are actively made to oppress minorities in your country, right? And thirdly, we said that this will exist more in your world. And this is the analysis they never really tackled. We came up here and talked to you about how parties like KKK and Golden Dawn were driven underground. It's going to be extremely dangerous. And why? Because these parties will now feel the government is actively passing laws that discriminates against their opinions and their opinions of people, right? Which is why they're more likely to now lash out at these minorities because they're not able to speak out against them anymore. We don't think these parties will stop existing under their model. We think the negative effects of them are going to get much worse and exacerbated. But before I move on, I'll take this POI.
What concrete proof can you bring us that just because some people in Pakistan are discriminatory, these juries will always discriminate against the minorities?
Ladies and gentlemen, if your government is actively oppressing gay people within your country and your government elects your jury, your government elects your judges, you have to show us how there isn't a 98% chance that jury elected by your government isn't going to be directly reflecting their opinions. Not our burden, it is yours. Lastly, we said, ladies and gentlemen, our entire argument about discourse, right? And here's why discourse is so important. We gave you the example of the women's rights movement, about the black movement. We feel if you chase back time in history, right? All of these movements started off, it wasn't because the government was actively protecting these minorities within your country. It's because there was dialogue. And we don't think Team Proposition has the right to come up here and claim, no thank you sir, what dialogue is. We think hate speech, we think all kinds of speech is healthy dialogue. Because you can't quantify what leads to social change in the end. It might be a specific kind of dialogue, or it might just be me, someone coming in insulting me that causes me to speak out against the such structures that are oppressing me, which leads me to actively work towards social change. No thank you sir, productive minute. And lastly, let's talk to you about autocracies, right? The only response they had to our entire argument was that this will continue to happen in these countries. We say, ladies and gentlemen, this happens in these countries because your government has banned these minorities from speaking, has already censored these minorities from speaking in the status quo, and we are trying to change the status quo, right? So basically what's going to happen is, if you give your government monopoly over this, they get to decide what quantifies as hate speech and what doesn't. So if the government of Pakistan thinks that the Ahmadis and them speaking out quantifies as hate speech because it's going to lead to other people in your society being actively hurt, the government will then be able to pass this law and no one will be able to hold them accountable. And for all these reasons, we are proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, Nani. Speaking time was 8 minutes and 16 seconds. It's now my pleasure to ask Sean to give the opposition's reply speech.
Speech is powerful, speech is empowering, and speech is provocative. Speech empowers minorities to provoke the social norms and agitate change. At this juncture of the debate, two worlds emerge. I'm going to take you to a walk into the world of Team Argentina and into the world of Team Wales, and then decide which world you think is best for minorities. So let's take a look into the world of Argentina. It was a world that was lacking in principles, right? It was a world where we told you that to make something criminal, you have to make it of definitive harm. You have to prove this very basic criteria. So what do we hear? First of all, we pointed out on the POI that will you prosecute against feelings? The response they gave us was no, don't trivialize the debate. This is a very important point, because if you will not prosecute against feelings, this means you'll prosecute against all the other kinds of criminal criteria already used, which is definitive harm. So the onus is now on you to prove that hate speech falls under definitive harm. So let's analyze what they said. They said a few things. We told you that calling someone a racial slur, like calling me a racial slur, does not definitively cause me to want to hurt other people, but more importantly, you can't quantify the reaction I have. You cannot quantify the amount of hurt I feel from a particular racial slur. It was a very simple analysis we brought to you. We had no good response. We also told you they won't definitively promote hatred around society. We told you that just because you scold somebody with a racial slur doesn't mean that people will go out there and start causing harm in society. So we say on these two grounds alone, there is no definitive harm on the first level. All they did was to repeat the response on how it will cause people to go out there and commit violence, and never once engaging about analysis that not everyone will be hurt after being racially insulted, and more importantly, in the same way, go out there and commit some form of violence or the other. On this ground alone, we think they have no principle analysis that could actually justify making it criminal. On that ground, we think their principles cannot stand. But more than that, it was a world that was very idealistic, but then again, very unrealistic, right? It was a world that claimed to champion change and education, where every speaker wanted to be a part of the solution and not the problem. But we told you, by making such comments criminal, the racists will still be racist. The bigots will still be bigots. When you criminalize these comments, what happens is you force them to go underground. So they will continue their bigotry underground. Now there's no one out there to challenge their comments in the open, which means you can never actually remove the kinds of bigotry that these people have, to remove the evil and the hatred that they have, and never create the kind of social change and acceptance for minorities in this world. We say ultimately, they are the ones that perpetuate these kinds of oppression against minorities. They don't help solve it. And more than that, it was a world that wanted cosmetic change, right? It was a world that wanted very superficial change. It was a world that wanted to protect human rights, but only exacerbate the assault on the human dignity of minorities. It was a world that wanted to use the courts. Panel, this was a response I brought to you on my first speech of opposition. It took them 2 other speeches before their third speaker finally came out to defend their response. They said, we told you that judges are installed by the majority. We gave you the example of South Africa. We told you that jury are usually the majority, which means ultimately when you use their mechanism, the minorities will still continuously be oppressed all the same anyway. So we told you that the majority control the government. We say they craft laws to decide what hate speech is and stifle change by robbing the voices of the minorities. We told you how they prevent the Ahmadis in Pakistan from speaking out in response. We told you how they prevent the gays in Russia from speaking out in response. We told you how they fundamentally prevent journalists and Muslims in Saudi Arabia from speaking out in response. Ultimately, they were a world that fundamentally hurt minorities, not a world that championed them. So let's take a walk into the world of Team Wills. It was a principled world. It was one that recognized the qualitative difference between assault and hate speech, and we fundamentally followed all the jurisprudence and criteria that fundamentally set out why some things are criminal, and on that ground alone, we think they are principled and outright. We will vote and empower minorities because we prevent governments from using hate speech laws from continuing to silence the minorities in this world. We say it's important that we empower minorities with a voice, and that way we use that to actually giving them a voice because they can now, regardless of their small numbers, create and cause thought-provoking change and therefore agitate for acceptance. Ultimately, because Team Wills is the world that supports minorities, we empower them and we create social change. We're very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, Sean. This speech was 4 minutes and 5 seconds long. It's my pleasure to ask Leo to finish this debate and to give the proposition speech.
So while team opposition here was trying to make the minorities revolt and promote chaos and a lot of other things, we've actually proven our 2 burdens throughout the whole debate. The first one being that this further protects human rights or minorities and vulnerable groups, and the second one that it aids in the reduction of hate. So these 2 questions we've answered with a yes. So moving on to the first one, about the protection of human rights. So what have we seen here on site proposition? We told you that it does, because all of these hate crimes and these hate speeches actually go against our basic human rights of not being discriminated, of going against our own personal fulfillment, of our right to exist. And these, at the same time, generate violence from the majorities towards the minorities, like we gave you the example of Nazi Germany, and in the other cases where the minorities are the ones who revolt because of this, because they are the ones who are being oppressed and they have no other way out. So we have proven to you that because of this violation of human rights, it is that we consider this to be a criminal offense, to have to be a criminal offense because it actually is hurting someone. Actually, it's violating their rights, which is the principle of why we believe this should be a criminal offense. But what have we seen on side opposition? We've seen a side opposition that not only didn't engage with our human rights argumentation, but second of all, they just told us that they just denied it. They just said, you can insult a person, and they have the choice to react, and they have the choice to say, okay, this is hurting me or this is not. Well, this is a tendency the team opposition have to have the whole debate, but not only is this isn't true, but we have also shown you that that is not how feelings actually work, and that people don't have the ability to say if that hurts them or not. And the second speaker of team proposition can say that it doesn't affect him, but a reality check would say that in most people it does, and that's why we have the problems that we have today. So, we're on to the second question. It doesn't aid in the reduction of hate. So on side proposition, we explained an analysis on how this actually doesn't allow the expansion of the message of this hatred, how this doesn't help for the rehabilitation, and how this is setting a precedent, and how